Well, thank you so much for coming out on such a cold evening. Some time since we've seen such a full room for a meeting, and I have been away a bit because I've had surgery, so this is the first time I've come back to chair a meeting, and it really heartens me to see you all here. Many of you, of course, know Joe because he's been vice chair since 2021. But I did ask him to give me a list of his qualifications because they are quite impressive. Until 2020, he was Associate Professor in Urban Planning and Development in the Department of Real Estate and Planning at the University of Reading, and head of undergraduate programs at the Henley Business School. During his 34 years as an academic, he undertook major research into the formulation and implementation of regional, strategic, and local planning policies, and therefore he's a very useful person to have on our committee. And before that, he was a senior planning officer at county and district levels of UK local government. So he's also got that practical knowledge in addition to his academic knowledge. Very recently, in fact, just in December, I think, he completed his PhD, which he'd put on ice for many years, on the development and redevelopment of Huntley and Palmer's biscuit factory in Reading. And I think on the back of that, he has been appointed a visiting fellow at Reading University. So I think we are very lucky to have him this evening talking about a subject about which I think he knows quite a lot, as we shall discover.
Thank you very much, Ian. Today's talk is something that when I arrived in Dorchester, or before I arrived in Dorchester, I took an interest in, the main development aspects of the town. And when you start digging back in history, you start seeing Eldridge Pope mentioned in many cases on land and property development, including the brewery. So when I arrived in Dorchester, only less than 4 years ago now, I thought I want to research this, and I've sort of had it on my agenda to go into the history centre and dig out files and research it. But actually, it was only in the last kind of month or so that I've actually really started this work. So I have to apologise straight away to say this is all very initial. My initial sort of scoping work on Eldridge Pope and its land development process. I will continue to work on this, and I think in this room there's probably many people that know more about what I'm going to talk about than I do. So I think I'm looking sort of for ideas and suggestions and information that will help me understand the land development process of Victorian Dorchester more than I currently know. So I apologise to start with. The first thing to mention is that I've called it Thomas Hardy's land development developer, Eldridge Pope, Thomas Hardy's land developer. And basically I'm paraphrasing John Seeking's corporate history of Eldridge Pope, which obviously says Thomas Hardy's brewer. And I just thought, yes, they were a big brewery, but also this bit sort of under the surface of it about this land development process, I think is an important component. And it kind of works both ways. The brewery fed money in to allow Eldridge Pope to buy and develop land, but equally it was flowing the other way. It also supported the brewery, particularly I think in the early stages. So money was being made, profits was being made through land development as well as brewing. So it's an interesting kind of twist going on here in the Victorian economy of Dorchester. I think, as Ian said, I've recently got my doctorate, and I don't know if anyone does know this. If you look up Dr. Doak on Google, you'll find that he's a villain. There's online gaming called GoldenEye, but it's James Bond, and Dr. Doak is one of the villains in GoldenEye. So if you do search for me, try and get me right. This is an overview. Like I said, the objective of my research, which is ongoing, is to map and evaluate Eldridge Pope's role in development of South and West Dorchester. If I find there's other bits of Dorchester, and I think there probably is other bits of Dorchester also affected by their land and property dealings, almost certainly around the pubs, I know, then there's even more to be said about this. So in 2 years' time, I'll come back and I'll hopefully give more of a definitive evaluation. So, as I said before, I've only just started, so it's initial findings, initial kind of scoping that I've been doing. But I wanted to do it, so I plugged myself into this talk, thinking, right, that will force me to do the work. And as usual, 2 weeks before the talk, I thought I better do the work now. So what I'll do is I'll cover a little bit the context, the rise of Eldridge Pope, just to sort of set the context for the company. The growth of Dorchester. I'll show. I love maps, and so I'll be showing a lot of maps in this talk. So we'll run through the kind of growth of Dorchester using the mapping that I've got. Then I'll focus down on the land purchases by Eldridge Pope, and it's not so much Eldridge Pope as Alfred Pope is the main person involved here, and looking at the kind of phases of their land development process. And I say phases, and I will kind of go through them, 1, 2, 2A, 2B, 3 and 4. But in reality, a lot of this was going on at the same time. I just don't know how Alfred Pope did it, because he had his finger in so many pies around Dorchester that, it was quite, very impressive, really. I'm going to briefly map. This is the academic approach now. Alan Rowley knows this all very well. Alan and I taught at Reading, and we used to teach development. And one of the things you think about when you look at development processes, property being made, you think about all the actors that circulate around development project. And of course, it's mammoth. And I've only just started to map out the key actors in the Eldridge Pope story. And finally, I want to look at some of, again, my initial thoughts about outcomes, because this happened, 100 years ago plus, but we're still living with some of the outcomes from that process. And so I'm starting to map out what kind of the legacy of that development process. And so again, it's underdeveloped, but it's some initial ideas. Moving on. Now, I am working on an Eldridge Pope timeline. So this, you can't see it very well, but it's running from the 1790s right through to the present day. So this diagram goes over here somewhere, up into the present day. And of course, the other bit of the Eldridge Pope story I'm also working on is the redevelopment of Brewery Square, which again is another fascinating story, I think, which I haven't dug into. But my long-term objective is to kind of do the whole story, maybe for another PhD, I don't know, or a book, maybe, I don't know. What I've done here is I've kind of color-coded a bit. So when you get orange, or in this case brown blocks, this tends to be things to do with property, land and property. I think the yellow bits are pubs, when they buy pubs up. So I'm kind of doing this across the whole thing. But I think to start with, just briefly talk about where this all came from, where Eldridge Pope came from. And it really was Eldridge, Charles Eldridge and Sarah, Charles and Sarah, they write community plays about it. And they started off really, if we can go back, just go back to the beginning, or near the beginning, go back to 1829 there. In the 1820s, Charles and Sarah marry, and Charles moves into Green Dragon Brewery on Derngate. So the Eldridge brewing business really started with the Green Dragon Brewery on Derngate. And they did a pretty good job. They steadily built up trade. They started building up the pubs that they were controlling and owning. So they were building up a nice business there. Now, over the next, let's see, 40 odd years, there were a number of people dying and people being left shares or part of the business. So there's a fair amount of transitions going on here with different people coming in and out of the story. But I'm going to move quickly on to 1871. This is really a key date for me. 1871, John Tizard, who'd been left part of the business by Sarah Eldridge when she died. He dies, and the Pope brothers basically assume control. They'd slowly kind of got a part of the business, Eldridge Pope, and then when John Tizard dies, the Pope brothers basically assume full control. Now, in terms of the brewery, it was Edwin Pope, Alfred's brother, that focused on the brewing process. So his job, if you like, was focused on making the brewery work. Alfred was much more of an operator. He was a solicitor by background. It goes together. And he had been involved in various, I think, forms of land and property transactions beforehand. So he focused his attention on the land and property side of the brewery and surrounding areas. So 1871 is kind of a key date, really. Now, if you can beam back out, I put a ring around. This is the period that I'm going to be focusing on. From the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s is really the kind of key time when this process of land purchasing was going on. It was during this period, and you'll see the dates, or I'll talk about the dates for each parcel later on. But this is really the kind of key time, and you can see all the brown blobs here, all various land purchases taking place. Putting this again, another contextual thing is to watch the development of Dorchester. And the reason I'm putting these maps up partly is because it shows the impact that the Pope land development process had on the growth of Dorchester. So I've got maps from the 1840s, from the tithe map, before anything else was happening really in Dorchester in terms of land development around it. The 1888 Ordnance Survey, the 1902, the 1956, and the 2000, and right today, again, just to bring it up to date so that you can see Dorchester in its glory. Here's the tithe map, and you can see again, very, very clearly the Roman town of Dorchester, the walks which followed the Roman walls, and Fordington are down here. The Roman town was surrounded by land owned by the Duchy of Cornwall, and this is partly why it was constrained. Basically, development, if it was going to occur, was going to occur inside the walls, old walls, or in Fordington. Outside of it, the Duchy basically were reluctant to sell their land for development. But things changed. You'll see also, if you look in the town, persisted quite a few gaps. It wasn't fully developed. It wasn't intensely developed. And many of these areas were gardens and orchards and glebe land that was not developed. So again, the basic urban structure, even within the town, wasn't very dense. The other thing to notice, zooming back out, if we can come right out again, is that the railways weren't yet there. So this land, was agricultural. The routes of the railways weren't coming into the Dorchester story. If we can, again, just bring it out a bit and go up here. Up in the northwest area, we have some barrack developments. This is the cavalry barracks, which were developed in 1799, and Grove buildings adjoining to it, down Damers Road. We have the workhouse there. So we have some initial early Victorian developments occurring outside of the town, but not much at all, really. We can move on from this sort of picture of rural tranquility to the 1889 Ordnance Survey map. Again, strategically, if we can just bring it back up a bit, one thing, the significant thing about this map is that the railways have arrived, and they're coming in from London and coming in from Yeovil and Bristol this way. And this really is a kind of key moment, or this captures a key moment in Dorchester's history. And the railways really did stimulate, did a number of things. It stimulated development and economic activity, and certainly provided a key resource for Eldridge Pope Brewery in terms of their trade in beer. But also it cut off land outside of the Roman town. So this area inside the railway, it cut that off from the other parts outside of the railway. And the duchy were going through a process of preparing to enclose their strips in their agricultural land. And that combined, this fragmentation of their land holdings, that side of the railway, and the enclosure process that they were going to go through, they wanted people to help them do it. And so they turned to their local solicitor, who was Alfred Pope, along with George Andrews. And they were retained to basically organise and manage the enclosure and the sale of land. See, this is 1889, so we're kind of capturing the early stages of land development. These dotted lines occurring around the edge of Dorchester, and indeed Cornwall Road Estate has got a dotted line around it. This is the Ordnance Survey picking up development areas that have just been started to happen, and this is what Alfred Pope was involved in. There's a number of these little areas that are dotted around the town, and there's the Cornwall Road area there dotted because it's under development. Again, in terms of Victorian development, there is other things going on. We've got the waterworks and reservoir being built, 1854 to 1880. We've got the cattle market over at Fairfield being established, 1855 to 74. We've now got more barracks, so we've got the cavalry barracks, which were earlier. We've now got the infantry barracks also being built. We've got Max Gate, Thomas Hardy's house, being built as well on the fringe. And we also, inside the town, we have the prison being rebuilt based on the earlier version of it. And also, you can start seeing within the town, appears to be more dense development occurring. So the infilling of the town within the walls was happening as well. So Dorchester was growing. It was growing both out, but also intensifying development within the town. Okay, so like I said, this properly captures a key time that we'll be exploring in more detail. If we can move on to just 1902. So 1902, what you're getting now is you're starting to see the residential areas being built. So here we have Monmouth Road, which is called Mulberry Way, before it got renamed as Monmouth Road. And you can see development occurring along there. But again, still vacant plots around it. You've also got, similarly over at Victoria Park, you've got initial development occurring. I think this area is where Alfred Pope had a stake in, because there were two pubs, two hotels here, and also he seems to have owned property in Dagmar and Olga Road as well. So I think this is where, when we talk about what happened in this area, I think this is where Alfred Pope was operating. Right, we can move on to 1929. Now, again, just looking at Victoria Park, we'll go across to the west. You can see now this is now sort of building out. the building of Victoria Park area is now being consolidated. So the plans, which we'll talk about later, are happening. Monmouth Road, if we can move to Monmouth Road, 1929. Again, you can see more development occurring in Monmouth Road area, now called Monmouth Road, as opposed to Monbury Way. But again, there's still plots here that aren't being developed. I think one of the themes that comes across is how slow, thinking about north of Dorchester, how slow development was occurring, how long it was taking. And also, if we can come back out a little bit more, you've got South Court Avenue, and this area in the south here, which is the South Court Estate, which we'll talk about in a minute, is also the roads have been laid out, and development is on the verge of happening. So that's 1929. Let's have a look at 1956. Let's go to Victoria Park, over here. And you can see this is now built out as an area of Dorchester. Well, if we go further west, you see it's also been extended. This is when increasingly local authorities were coming into the development process and providing council housing. So a lot of this area was council housing. You're also finding schools being built or provided in these new residential areas. And if we look at South Court Estate, down here, again, you'll see that actually now in 1956, we are basically building out that South Court area as well. Okay, bringing it forward to today, 2026, hot off the presses, the latest Ordnance Survey, which manages to include just about the latest stuff going on in Poundbury. You bring it up. Let's go right back. Let's take a strategic view. Because one of the things we've got here on this map is we've got the ring road shown. It's included, and we've also got additional. Again, looking strategically, we've got additional urban extensions in Castle Park. Poundbury has happened or is happening, which obviously is significant. Mellstock Avenue, which is like the South Court Road estate extension. Thomas Hardy Gardens, again over this way. So again, we've got more development occurring. As far as I'm aware, this new development is not due to Alfred Pope. I've not allowed any space for north of Dorchester, so I think it's excluded from this map. We have the green fields again, a bit like the tithe map. Okay, so that's a sort of historical run through of the main processes going on of development. Let's have a look at the individual land purchases now, the Eldridge Pope process. I've mapped it on the contemporary latest map. So these are the areas that Alfred Pope purchased from the duchy, either purchased, certainly in these three cases, or in this case, Victoria Park, he was involved as part of a syndicate of different businessmen who basically were involved in buying Victoria Park. But you look at that area and it's substantial. It is a total area of about 220 acres, or 89 hectares. There's enough land, if you were building like now, for that, there's enough land for about 3,000 houses on that. So this is, this is a significant development site around central Dorchester. Let's have a look then at the individual phases that we were talking about here. So the first one I'm going to look at is the Cornwall Road Estate. In 1874, as I've already mentioned, Alfred Pope's law practice, Andrews Pope, and which then became Andrew's son and Huxtable, were retained to oversee the enclosure and sale of the duchy lands around Dorchester. The duchy's first offer was this area, is about 15 acres, but it does include Borough Gardens, what will become Borough Gardens down here. The area was on either side of Cornwall Road. There wasn't much interest in purchasing this, so Alfred's law practice was involved in trying to promote it, but there wasn't many takers. So they basically just stepped in and bought it. So they just moved in. They were selling it and they bought it. A very, very close deal. The amount they paid for it, I haven't found yet. I will find it. But I've been digging into the files and I haven't found the exact amount. There's bits of money, figures floating around all the records. So it is there. I'm sure it is there. But I haven't found it yet. So they bought it in 1876. The first sale of lots, which essentially are these, what are shown, the lots here, took place in 1876. This plan is actually from 1885, so it's later. And they are dealing with land and plots that they've already sold. So some of this is, the blue is building leases that have been sold already for 99 years, the blue. The yellow is reversionary leases purchases. And the red are basically plots that have yet to be developed. So it shows, again, the development was occurring incrementally over that period of time. If we look at the map, I've just taken a slot of the 1888 Ordnance Survey map. And again, you can see roughly the same picture there of some of the land being developed, some of the plots being developed and being built out, but other bits still lying vacant, waiting for development to occur. So that's 1888. It took until about 1910 for the whole scheme to be built out. So that's around about 35 years it took for Cornwall Road to be built out, again, slowly developing over time. I will be looking at more detail about, which builders were involved. I haven't been looking at that yet, but there was a number of individual builders taking plots and building on them and renting out to tenants or selling on. So again, there's a lot of detail that goes behind that kind of map. So that's Cornwall Road Estate, the first one off the blocks. Number two is, it's a large area, about 20 acres north of the railway, leading in towards central Dorchester. The Duchy again put this one up for sale, 20 acres. And again, Alfred Pope stepped in and bought it. Now, the reason he bought it, or one of the reasons he bought it, was to build a brewery. So this is an initial sketch plan by Alfred Pope, done the year before they actually purchased the land, and he was already thinking about what was going to go on it. He put pen in here. That was the site of the brewery, right next to the railway. Saw the opportunity the railway provided for the brewery, right next to the railway. But the rest of the plots will be available for villa development. So basically, that's what it was allocated for. So that's his planning. He starts planning his future land purchase. And of course, he builds the brewery very quickly. 1880 started construction, built that within a year. 1881 it opened. Designed by Crickmay, George Crickmay. And Crickmay was involved in a lot of what Alfred Pope did. Designed the brewery, but also were involved in drawing up the plans and layouts for many of the housing estates as well, as you'll see. Of course, the brewery was significant because it increased the capacity of the brewery. They moved from Green Dragon, which was very constrained and the lead was coming up, and they moved to this brand new brewery, which was a 50-quarter brewery, as they called it, which increased the capacity for the production of beer by Eldridge Pope. Let's move on to phase 2B. So to the north of the brewery area was this area. So this is the brewery here in that area. And then this is the villa development around Prince of Wales Road. So it's the northern part of that 20-acre purchase. South Court House, which was actually built in here along the walks, was constructed by Alfred Pope between 1892 and 1894. and adjoining plots were purchased by other businessmen to build their big houses as well. Again, the house was designed by Crickmay. Crickmay again involved in the design work for the house, working closely with Alfred. The Prince of Wales estate, as it was called, was laid out again with this kind of plan, and plots were sold, individual plots with named individual villas on it. And there's a sort of picture you can see from that period, from about 1880 onwards. Those villas were built, and they're still there today. The area, this part of the development was built out largely by the turn of the century, by 1900. They were relatively quickly built, again, close to the town, very much, I think, Alfred pushing it through. Okay, so that's 2B. Now on to 3. Phase 3 is South Court Estate. This again was a further release, so the Duchy released more land in 1894, this time to the south of the railway. So now we're jumping the railway. Alfred purchased the 67-acre estate in 1895. It took over 50 years to be built out. Partly, I think, and again, I've got to dig down into this, there were drainage problems in the south of South Court, and they had to be resolved before the southern area could be developed. So I think it was partly delayed by drainage issues, but again, I think it reflects housing market demand and the supply being provided across this whole area. A number of auctions took place, so this area was sold in batches. So there were auctions took place in 1897, 1914, and 1936. So land was still being auctioned off for builders to develop in that period. The sales particular, which Anthony's just drawn up, set a very clear signal, the beautiful character of its surroundings. The climate is mild and dry. To sportsmen, the neighbourhood is unusually attractive. Hunting, fishing, and yachting facilities in Weymouth. You can see they're selling South Court to a certain type of person, wealthy, rising middle classes and beyond. But certainly this whole image of a select suburban development is part of the sales pitch for South Court particularly. I've got a number of plans which come from the Records Office showing different stages of South Court's development. So this is just one that captures the whole estate, but there are further plans which show particular parts. There's one for Monmouth Road area. There's one later on for this area around here. Again, all linked to the kind of auctioning off of the site at different stages. Okay, let's move on to the final phase of the Pope development process. So this is Victoria Park, and Victoria Park, like I said, was different. It was a syndicate. You can kind of imagine that even Alfred Pope couldn't handle this one as well as what he was doing across the other parts. So he joined with others. So this is a 120-acre development, which is too large for Pope. He joined with 13 other local businessmen to form a syndicate, led by the Mayor of Weymouth, Charles Jesty. So Charles Jesty was the lead partner in this syndicate. Alfred joined the partnership, or the syndicate, to develop it. The land was released by the Duchy in 1896. So again, it's all happening very close together, this. You know, in terms of the years, there's not much gap between these phases. The sale was completed within a year to the partnership. There are figures here for the amount of money paid by the different partners. This is for each member of the syndicate paid this amount. The total, if we go down, was almost £25,000 for the whole chunk of land. Similar to South Court, there was a series of auctions took place. They took place from about 1900 onwards, 1904, etc. It took another 30 years for the site to be developed. As I mentioned, Alfred Pope's involvement seemed to be around Dagmar and Olga Road area. So if we can just zoom back out. And I thought it's kind of interesting when we zoom across the whole, get the whole estate up, Alfred Pope has sort of taken a different line here. This is the area where Pope, I think, is involved. And again, this could be, people could prove me wrong, I can find out otherwise, but I think he was in this area. Certainly I found there's land dealings going on in this area, and he's certainly involved in the pubs. But this area is a sort of artisan housing. It's not the big villas that he'd been building in other parts. This is more working class or skilled working class housing, right next to the Reading West railway station. So it's a different kind of a take. And it was interesting that this part of the scheme got developed first. Now, partly because it was right next to the railway, right next to the town. But this one got developed first. And I'm kind of thinking possibly just because Alfred Pope was just used to developing. He was probably quicker than the other partners in the syndicate in getting his act together. But that certainly got developed first. It needs further research to dig down into this process, but that's my hypothesis. Moving on, who are the key actors? This is happening over an intense period of time. Who was kind of orchestrating? Who was controlling? Who was influencing this process? And you've got to start with the Prince of Wales and the Duchy. You know, the Duchy. This is the Duchy land. They were releasing. They were enclosing their strip farms, and they were releasing land around Dorchester. I'm sure Alfred Pope was involved in persuading the Duchy to release more land, or in certain places anyway. But certainly, you know, when you look at it, and I need to find out exactly the kind of relationship that was going on here between Pope and the Duchy, not the Prince of Wales, don't think direct anyway. Now, Alfred Pope, and also his brother to some extent, but it is really Alfred Pope, he is at the centre of the web. He's the person that's orchestrating things, pulling strings, initiating, getting the money, getting the political support of the town council, which he was a member of. In fact, he was a mayor of Dorchester. So we've got the Duchy, we've got Alfred Pope, but there's also others being drawn into this process, particularly, as I've mentioned, architects like Crickmay, and he wasn't the only one, but certainly Crickmay was significant. Surveyors, auctioneers involved in the land dealing and selling going on. Solicitors on the legal processes. Then the builders being brought in. Again, I think looking at the builders, they seem to be quite passive in this process. They're on the receiving end of the land offered by Pope and others. So I don't think builders were orchestrating things. They were certainly implementing things in terms of building out. Again, I've got to dig into the local building networks that were going on here. I mentioned drainage issues. So, you know, utility companies and later agencies have an influence on this. You know, they've got to provide some of the basic infrastructure. So there's a role there for them. The town council, in some respects, the town council was heavily controlled by Alfred Pope and his colleagues. So, you know, you could say they're almost one and the same. That's the political arm of Alfred Pope. But also, I think you should also think about the people that moved in, because in terms of shaping these parts of Dorchester, the people that bought or rented property were a key part in making it happen and making it, you know, active and going to churches and shopping and, you know, living. So again, that's another dimension that probably needs further work. Finally, I've kind of put central government. There's not much sign of central government intervention going on here, but certainly during the process, planning was ratcheting up. The planning system was developing, and particularly after the Second World War, which is probably mostly after our development process, the planning system will be much more influential in influencing development. So that's my initial take on the main actors. And finally, moving to the next slide, I have more maps. What's the outcomes? Well, this is about planning. This is about urban planning. So they were planning Dorchester. They were greening the town. They were segregating the town, and they were representing the town. So let's just go through this next few slides. So this is the map again. I just want to emphasize that the scale, the sheer scale of Alfred Pope's role in basically developing Victorian and Edwardian and post-Edwardian Dorchester. They were essentially the planners. They were the people that laid out, used their designs, their ideas. It wasn't local authority planners like me doing this. It was the private landowners. So they were planning. They planned and laid out Victorian Dorchester. Secondly, greening. Now this is a satellite photograph, recent, of the green intensity, the intensity of plants, of plant cover around and inside Dorchester. And the intensity is shown by red. So if it's red, and the deeper red it is the greener it is. And there's no dispute, I think. You often find in the areas around where Pope was operating, there's quite a density of tree cover. So on the positive side, Alfred Pope contributed to the urban greening of Dorchester by their planting. And he was very much into planting trees, and I haven't dug fully into that process yet, but certainly it was very important in laying out avenues with tree-lined and with sumptuous gardens. And also, of course, he was involved in the borough gardens in the sense of creating a urban park. So greening, I think, is another thing that I want to dig into. And how did they do this? And really, it's about the covenants and particulars that they laid down in terms of the builders' regulations, if you like. It's a bit like the Prince of Wales on Poundbury, laying down stipulations on codes of tree provision, of building lines, etc. Again, I need to dig into that more. Moving on. Segregating. I mentioned South Court, which basically is this area here. Now this is a sort of social area analysis. This colour here are sort of relatively wealthy suburbanites. It's a suburban social group, really. And you can see that this is the concentration in Dorchester of that kind of housing, those kinds of people. So by the developments that Alfred Pope was doing, he was creating social areas occupied by particular classes of people. So the social division, if you like, segregation of Dorchester owes something to Alfred Pope and his development processes. Again, it's something I want to explore a bit more. You see examples in the sales particulars, the way they're selling a lifestyle. And of course, when you often develop further on the edge of that, you continue that kind of theme. It becomes, that's the area, so that's the kind of housing you're going to provide in that area. So it kind of perpetuates those kind of social divisions. And finally, representing. I've mentioned already the town council. There's Alfred Pope up in the corner. This is 1897. These names are people that were involved. This is the club. This is the network, the social network of businessmen that were instrumental in dealing and planning and building the areas that we're looking at. Many of these were in the syndicate of Victoria Park. So the town council was representing a certain group of Dorchester residents, the ones that were involved in building out a lot of this area. So a very, very cosy relationship. I'd also say there's more to representing Dorchester than just the politics. You know, the town council is a political representation, but the brewery, as an economic entity, a dominant economic entity in Dorchester, also represented Dorchester. So people know Dorchester did know Dorchester because of the brewery and the beer that it produced and the quality of the beer, or the strength of the beer in the Hardy Ale case. So the brewery was also representing Dorchester, giving an image of the town. So there's kind of multiple aspects to this representing the town of Dorchester. That just about finishes my initial research. So I leave you now to pick it apart by asking questions or disagreeing totally with what I've come up with.
Did the thinking of Ebenezer Howard and the Garden City movement have any effect in the very late 19th century, early 20th?
I think it did, but I haven't come across it yet. I haven't come across the direct, obvious quote or reference to it. But then it's early days in the research. But you can tell that a certain quality of residential area and residential and neighbourhoods are being created with acknowledgement of those kind of ideas that were coming from the Garden City movement. So I think they were influential. I haven't found direct linkages between it, though.
Going into my background, which is a bit to do with farming, I think there must be a connection with what you've done already, with what happened with the Land Enclosure Acts. Mm-hmm. Because Bushy could almost do what it wanted, but there was I think there was quite a case when they tried to get a parliament to agree that all the little people who had, 20-yard strips, because they never kept it year by year. No. You had to keep moving, and also your neighbours could walk across your ground to get to their strip. Yeah. And it was very inefficient. And there must be some connection at the end of the 19th century, when the town was beginning to grow again, or get bigger and bigger, that Labour would be interesting, because they would have been spending a lot of time wastefully out there on the fields doing nothing, and they would have had less sons than they would have had in the 1500s and 1600s. And then, of course, disease and other things came along, but so health got better, so you didn't have to have so many children. So I wonder what size of family they were planning on in the original development here, and the correlation between people leaving the land to then be free to work building in the brewery, whatever else there was going. There must be some connection, which I'm hoping some people over there who might know a bit more about all this than me on the research can look into that with you.
Yeah, well, again, I think it's to be discovered, this process and the relationship with enclosure. I do know that the duchy's sort of control, the Prince of Wales' control of their land changed in the late 18th century, and that was brought within the control of Parliament, and basically they started ratcheting up the demand to make money out of the land. So there was pressure, I know, on the duchy to sell, hence it was responding, I think, partly to making profits, as opposed to just having this monastic lands supply, bringing in rents from the strips and that.
Alfred Pope was my great-grandfather.
Lovely.
And I'm interested that you talk about Alfred, but also Eldridge Pope being involved in these property developments. My impression was it was all Alfred working on his own initiative. And probably in the background was Alfred's father, John Allen Pope, who was a tenant farmer down in Sutton Point. But he did farm 2,000 acres, and he had quite a lot of capital. And I think he was involved in helping Alfred to buy into the Eldridge Brewery. But I suspect he probably also helped in the property development.
Yes, I agree with you. I know in broad terms that is exactly what is said. So I'm kind of aware of it, and I'm kind of looking, when I'm researching, I'm going to be looking for where the money, follow the money, where's the money come from? Now, some of it is sort of saying, well, that some of it's for the profits from the brewery being used, but it's too early for that, really. So he was getting money, and I know there was loans being made by his father to him, to particularly the 20 acres of the brewery site, really. So yeah, I think you're right that. And his father was quite ambitious for his sons, and so he was helping them along the way whenever he could. And I think providing the money for some of this would have happened.
Well, John Allen Pope arranged for 2 of his sons to be trained as brewers.
Yeah,
He could see what was happening with the railway and the potential here. And then he arranged for Alfred to be trained as a solicitor.
Yeah.
So you have a good mix of of talents there.
And that kind of went on, didn't it, through the the years.
But Alfred was a very vigorous man.
Yeah.
As you would imagine, for his activity. And he had a family of 11 of boys and a 4 of girls. But I think there is also research being done on this for the community play one before last.
Yeah.
And I don't know who it was, but they actually did some research on these developments that Alfred did with the duchy land.
Right.
And the point you're making is there were no other buyers, so he stepped in. And it seemed that there was a lot of pressure from the town. It was very poor quality housing and overcrowded. Pressure from them to get the duchy to release land so that they could have more housing in Dorchester.
Right. I mean, I know about that research. I haven't read it as part of this, preparing for this talk. So I will go back and read they produced a booklet, didn't they? Kind of compiled their research together into a booklet, which I've got, but I haven't used for this. But thanks for the heads up.
After the land was sold off and developed, was there any return from that to the duchy other than just the immediate sale of the land itself?
Good question. As far as I can tell, it was just an immediate return to the duchy. Obviously, the Alfred and other partners were getting a return from rents. So there was ongoing. I found again, almost by chance, some rents coming in 1960s or something. Still bringing money in, not a lot, but still bringing money in. So for the popes and others involved in that development, they were getting some of them were rents, but some increasingly they started selling off the property to tenants, to people that wanted to purchase rather than to rent. So it kind of changed post-war mostly, I think. So yeah, that's an interesting dynamic, the way that money is being made from property. Where's it going? And I think it wasn't going to the duchy in terms of rent, but I may be wrong.
I've got a question.
All right.
You mentioned about the pace of development on the Cornwall estate, and it took 35 years to do that. With Poundbury, we've seen that's taken 20 years. We've had other recent talks here about future developments, but again, say it's a multi-decade process.
Yeah.
There's different market dynamics now.
Yeah.
Compared to 100 plus years ago. How was that influenced by supply versus demand? Do you have any perspective on that?
Well, you do get the impression that they are relying, certainly in phases 1, 2, for local demand they're providing for local demand, it seems. But South Court is the interesting one to me, because they're obviously selling this, I think, to immigrants coming in. So they're almost selling a lifestyle of hunting and yachting. And the way it's sort of worded, it seems to be directed at people outside of Dorchester to come here and occupy this space and live a good life. But again, the other thing is to map out who did occupy the houses, which again is something I can probably selectively because trying to do the whole thing is impossible, but you could do some selective sampling of different developments to see who in the census was moving in, what their occupation were, where they came from. So you could do some kind of migration analysis of who was occupying the houses in different parts of these developments.
I've heard from various sources that much of the building was actually to accommodate workers at the brewery, the artisan buildings, and also Prince of Wales Road for managers and directors at the brewery. Are you aware of anything that's directly Pope's development in order to accommodate those the large expanse of his workforce?
I will say not yet, but you've given me a heads up again in terms of digging down a bit to see who was occupying. You know, my PhD on Huntley and Palmer's came to similar conclusions about the Palmer family's involvement in land development in Reading was often linked to housing their workforce. They had a labour supply problem, which I guess the brewery would also be maybe having issues with. So providing housing, which then, again, early days, but I've come across one sale of property in Dagmar Road, which is a brewery worker. And I thought, yeah, probably the brewery workers are moving into these places. So I just got one little example, but it's something I think probably is going to happen. I'm going to find that.
I would say in the last couple of years, I've done a couple of tours with Jeremy Pope, walking tours around Brewery Square, and he has explicitly said that a lot of the villas opposite the junction on Weymouth Avenue, those were for the management of the brewery.
I think it seems like my hypothesis, your hypothesis, or knowledge is yes, and I will be exploring that, mapping out all these relationships that are going on. Lloyd George survey of 1911 is a very good source of property analysis. It shows who owns the property and who occupies it and how much they pay. It's a very good source of information. And again, 1911 would be a good time to dig into some of that stuff to see. And it's got Alfred Pope's name on lots of pages. He was owning lots of property or land, and so you could find out who was occupying it.
Okay, well, thank you very much. If there's no more questions, I'd like to thank Joe for his talk. Okay, everybody come.
Thanks.